So Lee asked me to talk about this, and I gotta say, initially I wasn't really stoked because I do spend all my time, man, these lights are bright, this feels like my former life. I spent all my time working with people. I do a little bit of teaching and a little bit of presentation, but like the things that I would talk about would be real experiences working with real teams. So I'm very low on the theory, very high on the experience and the practice. And I tried to put these words as small as I can. I had them even smaller, but I thought that would be too goofy because I don't want to make a big deal out of this. And I'm not going to leave you with a model or a framework or a recipe. In fact, what I want to try and give you is some ways to say, how are we being successful? 10 years into this Agile space, I think it's very much time to start talking about what does success look like? How do we kind of measure it, or at least communicate it to people? So in thinking of something that had to do with big Agile or scaling Agile, I guess I'm more interested in how do you grow agility, whether it's one team or 5 teams, one location, 15 locations, because I work in all those different spaces. And so I chose to put a picture of Do It Up from the movie Big. So if any of you guys have seen this movie, the kid's name is Josh, and he's frustrated because he doesn't have what other people have, and he wants to be big. And so he goes to Zoltar, and he says, I want to be big, and dude makes him big. The next morning he wakes up and he's big, and the rest of the movie is him finding out about, well, it was kind of cool being small. Because when you're big, you have all these responsibilities and these things. And I think kind of what's interesting about it is that he didn't kind of go through the painful process of being a teenager. He just kind of got to be big right away. And what's interesting to me is 10 years into this Agile space, I literally have people call me up now and say, can you help us with the Agile? We want the Agile, or we want the Scrum. And I think like if those people were dude, they would be saying, I want big Agile. And if I were Zoltar, I would say, why? Why do you want that? Because I understand, like Josh, what they're looking for. They're saying, wow, this group over here, they got some good mojo going on. They're successful. They're delivering. They're kind of discovering. They're figuring out unknowns. But I don't know if it's just more. I don't know if the notion is just let's have more Agile. And so that's one of the questions I kind of want to start out with is like, when is more better? Is it, there are places I go into where they've actually took some of the ideas that are successful and they've started putting them into other places, and scaling has happened organically, and more is better. There's other places I go into, and the first thing I'm told when I walk in the door is all these numbers. So it's success through scorecard. We have N number of people doing Agile, or we have X number of certified folks, and both those things could be helpful, but neither one of them guarantees success. So just to take us outside for just a little bit, because I hear us talk about ourselves as a community. I hear kind of people talk about the word movement. So I wanted to kind of step out a little bit and say, how have other people dealt with coming up with a cool idea, building a community, and making it happen over time? And one of the terms I hear all the time is we call this a movement. And so at the risk of maybe kind of going down in flames, I thought I'd talk about 2 things that are a little bit dicey, one being politics. And so I don't know if anyone's read this book. This is a really fascinating book there's a series of letters between Jefferson, Adams, and Abigail Adams. And so you kind of rewind a little bit, and you have all these people out there working this kind of thing called democracy. What is it going to be like? What's it all about? And they don't really know, and the letters are really well written. And they're interesting because they're all over the place, and there are multiple perspectives looking at this new movement kind of coming to life. Now, I'm not making any kind of a political statement, but when you read these letters and you look at kind of where we are today, it's very different. It's not necessarily better or worse, it's different. There's a lot more people, a lot of time has transpired. So to even go a little bit dicier, the other thing I hear people say about Agile a lot is, well, it's a belief system. You have to believe in it, and that's some pretty heavy lingo. And so this is also a pretty interesting, little heavier book. It talks about like the history of 3 major religions, and the woman that wrote it is like part historian, part philosopher, part something or other. She's just a brilliant woman, and it's really interesting. You read how all these movements started with a small group of people that had something in common, that were going against the grain of a lot of people around them, and then over time how things have happened. And I think it's at least an interesting thing to look at for us, because we are just a little blip on history's radar. It's neat, I love what we're doing, but there's a lot of other people that have gone through 10 years of discovery and starting to come into some kind of a process. But grounding it a little bit more, I thought we could talk about something simpler, like cooking. Because it's a little bit more realistic and less dangerous than talking about politics and religion in front of a large crowd. So, if you've ever has anybody ever had a meal prepared by a chef? Like you're a restaurant, my wife's a restaurateur, so we always end up in these restaurants. And so, it's a pretty sweet deal. One person with really great skills cooking can produce a spectacular meal for a group of people. But their ability to do that goes away when the group starts growing, or when various requests come in. And so, that single chef only scales so large, and those skills aren't easily transferred to everyone. So maybe the next way to look at that, growing what's good in that experience, having a great meal served to you, is how does a restaurant work? So restaurants are a really interesting space. I'm sure many people here have worked at a restaurant. And restaurants are a situation where a lot of people know what they're supposed to do, but they also tend to do a lot of things in a dynamic manner. There's a lot of the things we talk about around kind of time boxing. And I often think of like when people serve up a story that's done. If it tastes good, then people are less likely to say, well, how did you do that? But if the food is crap, you send it back to the kitchen. It's like, dude, I don't want to eat that. If it happens enough times, you might have an angry person that parades into the kitchen. The next level of cooking is a whole different deal. So how does kind of growth happen in taking what's good with a chef and scaling it up to this industrial level? Well, no offense to the people that do this, because they do get it out on time, but as the consumers, at the end game, which meal do you want to eat? Which one are you interested in? And yet, this model still doesn't really work, because although it's creative and dynamic, it's not soft. And as simple as it sounds, at the risk of being Captain Obvious, software is soft. And there's a lot of people that use what we produce that don't think about that. They don't think about software being soft. And so one of the things I think about a lot is something that's near and dear to me is music. And I think music is a lot like software. A song does not come up and harden, and that's the end of it. You can't keep some songs from evolving. They change, you can record them, someone else records them. A lot of songs are passed through oral traditions, and so music is a thing that's filled with, especially in the commercial side, the need to deliver, blending with the need to be creative. So let's look at a couple of these people. Does anybody, by chance, bonus points if anyone can name who this orchestra is? It's a pretty obscure one. This is John Mclaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So dudes were nothing short of wildly innovative. It's pretty out there jazz. But if you listen to it, you might think, oh my God, these guys just improvise like crazy. Maybe because you don't know the structure. This music to you is like software to a user who thinks it's kind of magic. But there is a lot of structure. There's an enormous amount of structure, and there's improvisation. Now, when you scale up orchestras, you get a large group of people. Tangentially, when I was doing research for this, I found that the satisfaction rate of the average person in an orchestra is equal to that of the average garbage collector. So I'm not sure why that is. That could be because there's too many tyrannical conductors. But orchestras don't improvise. In fact, I've heard people argue that they do, but they play a structure, and it's really, if you think about this, I think orchestras, music is scaled better than cooking, in the sense that it's a good experience. You don't have to kind of dumb down the music. If you go a little bit further with this metaphor and you look at bands, it would be pretty hard in any criteria to say the Beatles weren't successful. Pioneers, innovative, excellent performances, filmmakers, actors, musicians, pioneers in the recording studio. And yet if you take a Beatles song and you scale it up and have a marching band play it, it just doesn't come out quite the same. Because marching bands, quite frankly, can't improvise, or they crash into each other. There's a certain set of constraints in being in a marching band. So it's kind of a perspective of how you take this thing and scale it. And so I want I want to talk about one more weird thing before I move on, and I'm not really going to tell you too much about it. I'm just going to play this for you, and if you've seen it before, don't tell the person next to you what it's about. And if you've seen it before, feel free to sing along if you'd like.
Talking about expectations? Expectations. What?
Ba, ba. Ba, 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 ba.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, dude definitely deserves a huge round of applause. So this is at a conference on neuroscience and music. And so the question, a simple question to you is, why did that work? Why, and so I asked this of a friend of mine who's a spectacular musician who it turns out knows Bobby. And we had this really interesting discussion. And he said, well, it worked because he's dude. And he went in and said, look, this isn't the first time he's done that. The first time he did it, it probably didn't work. I was going to try it tonight, but I thought I might go through the stage, and that would be embarrassing. But so part of why I think it works is because he has skills. It's not dude's first rodeo. He's put in a lot of time. We talk in the space about craftsmanship, or people talk about the 10,000-hour rule. It takes 10,000 hours to learn how to do something well. But if you roll back and look at what he just did from like a growth and a scaling perspective, he stood in front of an audience. He doesn't, just like this, he doesn't know anyone. He got them to sing along with him. Then he got them to sing on their own. Then he jammed over the top. Then at one point he sang a harmony with them. Then he got them to start extrapolating without really giving them any direction. And so it kind of brings you back to like, why? Why did that work for him? So if you take the part of him out of the equation and you say, why does it work? I think part of it is because he tapped into existing skills in the room. Some people that are musicians here might have figured out to use what's called a 5-tone scale. Everybody in this room knows that scale. Anyone that's ever sung Mary Had a Little Lamb. There's a lot of songs that are based on that. So I would argue one of the reasons he was successful is he got people to sing something they already knew how to sing. They just haven't sung it yet. And that's a really interesting perspective for me. That's very close to what I feel like I do on my best days, is not go in and tell people, you don't know what you're doing, I'm going to give you the Agile and we're going to be okay. I'm going to take you to Nirvana. I want to tap into what people are already doing well. One of the other guys on that panel was the person who wrote this book. His name's Daniel Levitin. Daniel Levitin defined groove as, groove is the quality that moves the song forward. Now that's a really interesting notion. That's a soft concept from a social dynamics perspective, and I would argue when you go into a space where people are successful, there is a groove. In fact, sometimes people don't know how it's happened. A lot of small companies I go into, I say, if you guys have the right stuff going on and the right people and you're doing well, how did that happen? And the answer I get a lot is, wow, good question. Because no one's really ever looked at that. So instead of telling people how to do stuff, I want to look at how we foster what's already there, challenge what doesn't make any sense, and grow this stuff. And I want to look at it in 3 dimensions. So the first dimension is within teams, the work we do. This is where I think a lot of the early discussion was around, we got to get this team successful. So how does that happen? But then it spreads in an organization, and what happens across teams? How do you get a group of people grooving, like an orchestra? And then outside of teams. And that's a very interesting discussion because there's a lot of people that aren't here that are essential to what we're doing that don't know a lot of the language that we're using. And to them, it sounds like that's that Agile stuff. We haven't kind of figured out how to make a connection. So let's start with within teams. So here we have Team Woody. So we have 3 people. For argument's sake, let's say they all know each other. They have some kind of similar skill set, and we're trying to kind of establish a groove with these guys. So my MO is to go into a company and say, what makes people a team today? How do they work today? What's working for them? What's not? Seems very simple. It's best found by asking them those questions directly and seeing how well they can talk to you. This is a funny group of dudes. So we were doing kind of what people call like an extreme hour. At the end of the extreme hour, you have to kind of build a product. So these guys chose to build a coffee maker. And if you're hip to the Burning Man Festival, you can see what they've produced here is the world's largest French press. It's an 80-gallon coffee maker. So it's a drum with a big screw on the top and a fire under the bottom, because that's what you have at the Burning Man Festival. They won the contest out of all these teams because everybody thought their product was the most contextually correct and the one that was the most viable. They figured out how to do it by kind of learning. So here's their little burn-up chart that they did. So they had to come together and figure out a product, and you can see that they were kind of not doing super well, and then learning happened. So that's one aspect of me is like, who does what and why? How much specialization is there? And this is true like within teams and across teams. And for some of the people here, this might seem kind of obvious. The next level up is, what's the context? And what are the constraints? And so I put 2 things side by side that are difficult to compare to each other, but interesting. And so one is a company from Eden Prairie, and they build, this is a jet from the Air Force in Australia. And what this mechanism is trying to do is tear the wings off, because they want to see what happens, how much stress can this jet take when they start ripping into it to see, will the other 20 that we have in the fleet crash next year? So they're sacrificing one. There's nothing simple about this world. There's a lot of very strong constraints because they're dealing with hard things. This is a company I don't work with, but I watched them kind of talk at the Startup Lessons Learned. Opposite end of the continuum, greenfielding a product. They are fully aware and assuming that what their ideas are wrong. And so they're trying to figure out how to learn. One of the things that they said that I thought was really interesting, because they don't use the word Agile very much, but they're all about agility. And they said, maybe the most important thing for us to do in the early iterations is to actually pay money to bring customers in, to put them in front of our product to see if we're building the right thing. So they might have sacrificed how many story points they got done with code because they were thinking, well, what's the next best investment? And that rings true for me. So I kind of look at constraints as there's 3 types. There are things like that machine there that are mostly immovable. You can't do anything about them. There's are ones that are somewhat immovable, and then there's the self-induced constraints. Those we can kind of do something about. So I want to know what end of the continuum some group's on before I engage and see if I can help. This is a 3rd practice that I've been using because I don't really subscribe to like branding. I'm not interested in any particular brand. I'm interested in trying to find a set of practices that help people. And I was teaching a group from a medical device company, and I was at the end of like a 2-day class, and I could see some of the engineers looking at me like, when is process dude gonna leave? Get him out of here. And so I said, well, let's not do this immersion. Let's go through and list what you guys heard that you thought was interesting. Which practices do you think are going to be helpful, and why? And it's a really simple notion. And so it's actually quite an interesting thing to do with people that have been practicing for a while, or a tool to kind of look at how you're doing across teams. So if you put user stories in here, or TDD, or CI, or even sprinting, if you want to. Like, why are you doing that? What's the value you're going to get out of it? And what's interesting is a very short discussion like this, for me, I would call this appropriate ceremony, makes a lot of the adoptions much more sticky, because right away people have ownership in it. They're not trying to do Agile, they're trying to figure out how do I use these tools. And if they can't express the value, then we could skip over that. Or if this is kind of squishy, I would say, well, let's put an example down, stolen directly from someone like Brian Merrick, who is always asking people to talk about examples, because examples are tests that you just didn't write down. It's a really great, it's a simple way to look at those things. And then this notion of like, well, I think it's going to be really helpful. You know, we're trying to do it because we really believe in narratives. I can imagine like a business person and a developer and a tester having a rich discussion, but the business folks don't sit with us. We're not sitting together. So you start mapping, you know, a mechanical thing against the value it's going to provide, possibly grounding it with an example and coming up with a set of constraints. And it's really an easier way, a stronger way, I think, to build out a process. And I could talk a lot more about what I think happens with like a team, but there's a lot of sessions about that, there's a lot of books about it, so I want to shift to like, how do you know that they're successful? And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think there's a lot of unnamed statements that are out there that are worth making. So if you look at like where we came from in the last millennia to where we are today, what are some of the big shifts that happen? And this is an interesting way to say, this is why it's helpful for us. This is a measure of success. And so the first one I put up is, we've moved from what's required to what's needed. We've moved from how many hours to what did we produce, because no one buys hours. No one buys code either. They buy things that you produce. We've shifted from how much did it cost to how much opportunity is there, or how much profit is there if you want to go. But I like the word opportunity because it's not always about profit. It could be about something else. Another big shift that's really subtle, that popped up early. A lot of teams in 2003 started saying things like, everything's a 5. That was a joke. I saw it pop up in all these labs because all these groups figured out, we're still pretty bad when you give us a big giant thing of saying it's about this big, plus or minus something. But when we figure out how to get it down to a certain size, then flow starts happening. And that's a really interesting and subtle shift, and you hear it come out in people's language. This is another one that's very subtle. So you have all these people that are worried about learning to estimate. If you're trying to learn to estimate in a dynamic space where things are always changing, that's a fool's folly. You can't be successful. But you can learn from estimates in that same situation to say, you know what, it seems like there's a wild divergence of opinions here. This is risky. This is unknown, something we've been trying to do for a long time. And if you just go back to your shops and you just count how many times anyone talks about exact estimates, that's your smellometer. Like, why do people want to talk about exact estimates? And there's a whole bunch of these, and this violates my idea and Edward Tufte's thinking of how many words should be in a slide, but I wanted to give people things that were pretty concrete because this is another one that's a really neat and subtle difference that's popped up in the last 10 years is, I want someone to help me with something. Maybe I'm pairing, maybe I'm not, and I say, could you look at my code? That's where we all started out a little bit more than a decade ago. And what would happen is the other person would come over and have to reverse engineer what it does on the fly. And the shift is when people kind of start talking about tests instead of talking about code, then you started moving towards outcome-based thinking. In, you know, at the most granular level. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish. My hypothesis is that it should do this. Let me show you what's going on. Let me show you my evidence. Let me show you the specific code. And that one's really subtle, but that's a shift that you always see. It tends to pop up a lot of times around when everything becomes a 5. So that's some ways of thinking about, you know, how you work inside teams, and that's a space that's kind of, there's a lot of writing and people talking about that. But let's talk about what happens across teams. So in the last slide, we had 3 different teams, but now we have Team Prospect, Team Jesse, and Team Woody. And how are these 3 going to work together? So there's a lot of different combinations of how they work together. A picture that I find myself drawing a lot, which seems to start really passionate conversations, is we've worked pretty hard in the Agile space to get good at this. So here's the team, and they've established some cadence. Kanban, Scrum, cycles, not that revved about that, as long as the cadence is kind of appropriate for the product or the domain they're in. And there's probably some business folks or product folks and some technical folks, and then there's some people with development skills and some people with testing skills, maybe some UX people, maybe an ops guy, not really sure. But what we've done good is we've set up a cadence, and that makes it easier to learn, easier to reflect. And that works pretty good until you get a bunch of these going on. And having been here for a couple days, I know there's a lot of people in this room that have N number of these going on. So one of the groups I work with has 19, another one has 23, and those are quite large, and that's a little bit like an orchestra. It doesn't mean they can't produce something interesting. It probably does mean there's going to be some other level of structure that happens in there. And so what I think we used to do is we had this broken down too geeky. So we had, this is kind of old school, we had the back end, the middle tier, and the UI guys. And in order to deliver, when the business needed to change direction, you had to turn all three of these at the same time. And so we've kind of been smart enough to replace those and say, well, we want whole teams, at the risk of using an overloaded word, feature teams, people that can build whole things. They have all the skills and the control they need to do that, but there's still a cross-cutting dimension. Now the cross-cutting dimension is something that you might call like architecture. And so I'm not up for throwing architects under the bus. The pesky ones, sure. As long as no one knows I did it. But I still work on some huge systems where there are multiple teams, and that's not actually a bad thing. It's meaningful in the context of what they're doing. It might be demanded by immovable constraints in their space, and there is cross-cutting thinking. And so I use this term cross-cutting for the geeks in the room. They know it came from the aspect-oriented programming folks. But what I see is there's also kind of this cross-cutting notion, cross-cutting values. So what cuts across the code? What cuts across the product? What cuts across the user experience? Concurrency, difficult things like that. And now we've set up a forum. We have a tool that I think is unknown for a lot of people. And so I'll say a product manager and an architect. And for argument's sake, let's assume they're both good people. Those people both have forums and vehicles and a cadence to deal with, the complicated nature of large systems development. So if you're that one team, if you're Team Woody, this might not matter to you. But a lot of the people in bigger companies, there are dependencies. And you're tied to your slowest dependency and at the risk of making an enemy. SAP is one of the slowest things I work with. To the SAP folks, it's the nature of the beast a little bit. But if we're not successful with that, we're not successful as a group. We're not successful as a company. So an architect that's truly concerned about duplication or integration, which are still enemies, they haven't gone away, can say, well, you know what, this thing is growing in all these spaces, and I'd like it to be centralized. So let's say instead of this being the SAP team, this is a central group. One of the groups I work with right now has a trading engine. There's nothing wrong with them having a trading engine. It's a centralized notion, but that's a producer, and there's 2 or 3 consumers out here of that. And so it gives us a vehicle to start figuring out what's the right cadence for developing in this producer-consumer relationship. And this, I think, is dumbed down into a scrum of scrums, which for me is a mechanical meeting where people get together for 15 minutes and you lost a much richer value of how do you do complicated systems development. Or in the case of this group right here, they're building a product. So this is 8 to 10 teams that all need to come together to deliver what's meaningful to the organization, and the organization delivers into an ecosystem, the educational ecosystem, which says we want things in quarters. Even if you have it done every day, we live in quarters. That's the nature of that beast. So you're not driving change into that system. On this side, they have kind of what I would call the discovery planning piece. So over here are a series of story maps. So if you walk through this, you would see that these are goals that someone's trying to accomplish. And then when you go down to the next level, there's little user experiences, and some are more detailed than others. But if you walked down that, you would see that all those stories together tell one big story. And that's a really powerful tool for working across groups, because when they go over to this side and say, gosh, roughly how are we going to get this thing out? You can see there's like little lines of tape. And so they're not stuck on, is that a 5 or is that a 12? Estimation is only one aspect of what's going on here. Yeah, they're trying to balance value and effort, but they're also trying to figure out the dependencies. They're trying to discover the unknowns. They're trying to build what I might call, like, ubiquitous product language, stolen from Eric Evans, which talked about ubiquitous language, but to get everyone to kind of talk about what this is as the same thing. So if I asked you guys all to write down what this is, some people would write down it's a laser, some people would say it's a remote control. What you want to call it is a clicker. But if you go into the store, there's probably not a clicker section, at Best Buy. And so that's an interesting notion to me, is like, how do you start building that language? And fundamentally in this group, because this is a perfect example of a company where separate teams were sprinting successfully somewhere. They sprinted for a while, and they all said, hey, where did we end up? And it's not like people are goofs. They're working really hard. But as a collective, they don't know where they're going. They're very focused on how they're going to get there. And that's why, for me, working with a lot of larger groups, I've shifted my thinking away from kind of calling it release planning to this like discovery planning, because I want to know what we don't know sooner. And that's a really powerful thing that we've established with Agile methods. You do have to break it down and start delivering. So that same vehicle, that same little story map, is a sweet little tool for me, because it allows me to say, okay, it could be there's one team, and the story map has a lot of the context that I'm looking for. It has who's involved, it has what they're trying to accomplish, their goals, and then it has this set of stories that speak to the task that person is trying to do, and then these are variations on that task. But from a delivery perspective, that might be kind of more raw discovery. From a delivery perspective, I can say, yep, one group is working on this, and so when we kind of ask to say, well, what should we build next? It's not take those 30 cars and prioritize them 1 through 30. Because I think that's kind of a software processes person idea of how you prioritize products. The product people that I'm around don't want one card. They're excited to see that delivery is happening on one card, but it's usually a thread of those that builds a meaningful user experience, and it's hard oftentimes to slice that very, very thin. If there's 2 teams, the value that I get out of this that's really neat is that let's just say this is the very user-facing piece where people are interacting with the system, one or more people, and they get to a point where control moves from system A to system B. And back here, yep, that user is still out there. They're still trying to accomplish something, but I'm not sure that user stories are a great tool back here. Because if one system is talking to another system and you write a story that says, as system A, I need to talk to system B so that I can do something, that feels like you've just stepped into the wasteful land of like process for process sake. And so a lot of the systems I work on that are in this space where this is an engine or this is a rules engine, all that stuff we try to specify with tests. And it's a really nice balance because it is still what's valuable to Dude here. And it's still like all those things need to happen in conjunction for him to get value, or a sequence of those, but it allows us to start separating teams because some of the systems I'm on have 4 systems deep from the user. And you could say, well, that's wrong. But I think if you go look at the industrial testing of an airplane, there's not a lot of simple solutions. Right? You can only stub out so many things until you have to stick the plane in a machine that tries to rip it apart. And it's bad if the machine tries to rip someone's hand off. It's a very complex space. So if you map that, and I just took a simple burn-up chart from a group, Jeff Patton and I were talking the other day, and we kind of said, well, here it is. It's like we've captured it in data. We're just not really talking about it like this. And so I'm kind of starting to think of this line. The amount we need to do is discovery, and this line is kind of delivery. So burn-up chart, not a fantastically interesting mathematical concept, kind of the inverse of a burn-down chart, but it starts kind of having the right discussion. Why is discovery bad? I think that's one of those things that we started out in what I heard from a lot of Scrum teams is you couldn't change anything once the sprint started. Well, what if change is actually good? What if that discovery is meaningful? What if you can learn something from this delta. In fact, there's groups that I coach that assume there's going to be growth in here. And that might be kind of a numeric version of what Tom DeMarco calls slack. Leave something in there. Don't have things be so tight. If it's kind of consistent, then you can do something with it. So, again, this violates how many words there should be on a slide. But even when you have more teams, I think it's more important to promote failure. And what I mean is that failures are not viewed as failures because science is all about failing. I always ask people, like, what's the difference between failing and learning? And one answer is the cost. Like if I burn through $5 million to your dollars and I come back and I say, dude, we spent all your money, but we learned a ton. You're not going to go, great, here's another 5, you know. But if you learn in small increments, it's a no-op. It's not a big deal. And so that's one thing, and I don't want to go through all these, but I do want to call this one out, because this is a very interesting manifestation that I see at organizations that are growing their Agile or trying to spread agility inside their company, is that in some instances, the idea of coaching is really stuck. It's organic. At Medtronic, they don't really worry about, you know, one person being coach ad nauseum. It's kind of more of a set of practices that different people do all the time. So they rotate through and everybody's somewhat responsible. At other organizations, coach has super high ceremony, and it's just about to become the bad manager of yesterday. It's starting to blossom into the same thing because it's calcified in its indoctrination. Instead of being an activity that almost anyone can do some level of coaching, and that's much more interesting to me. And aside from that, it tends to be something that I see in shops that are more successful. There's a lot of people doing it because it's a tough job. It's a huge job. So stepping out from within teams to across teams to outside teams. And so outside teams wasn't easy to kind of figure out how to display with my little Lego dudes. The movies, which, by the way, I made in my room last night, because that's a fun thing to do. Like, what do I mean by this? And so this is Jeff Patton and Naresh Jain and I basically on a walkabout in India. And the three of us are arguing passionately. And the reason I like hanging out with these guys is because they both have skills and they're both skeptical. They're not interested in just taking the status quo. They're also both responsible enough to not go in and just blow up organizations for the sake of change. And this is this questioning look that Jeff always gives me. And I put these words in his head with his permission. So, like, who are they and what do they really need? Because that's a really interesting question to me. And going further with that, it's like, are they on the outside? Are they on the outside of your team? Are they here? Who are the people that are not within these teams? They're not spread across these teams, maybe an architect on the top, but they are significant people that you need to make connections with in order to be successful. Who are those people in your world? And in some cases, I find that I don't really have kind of the right words to talk about them, so I'm going to use a simple kind of phrase, which is I'm going to call them the product people. And what I mean by that is that some of the simple tools that I think we've established are nice for getting the people that have interesting ideas. They're either inspired or informed or both, just gushing about what they want. Some of the tools we use shut those people down, just like that, because we force some word into their mouth when they're just talking about their product. These are some of the things when I'm sitting with those people and trying to have the value that I see in the Agile space be evident without being in their face, is I think they're talking about these. The sharp people in the space are saying, why are we building what we're building? Some people only know what they're building. Then it's really hard to figure out how you're successful. Who's buying it or who's buying in? Meaning, are you selling it directly to people, or is your currency actually not dollars, but number of users? Because that's a different model altogether. What do they really need? Now, one of the things I dig is Alan Cooper said to me, you don't listen to what people ask for, but don't give that to them. And I was like, what do you mean by that, dude? And I think what he's saying is like what Jeff always says is we need to stop acting like waiters and start acting like doctors. That's a great little Jeff Pattonism, because a waiter just takes orders. Okay, I'm ready to serve up the sprint. What are the orders? And there's no, it's very easy to drop into a model of like, I don't know, the product owner is going to come up with that. One of the groups I've been coaching lately, if I sat any one of you guys in their planning session, you wouldn't be able to tell who was a tester, who was a developer, and who was a product owner, because everybody has some level of ownership. Yeah, there's a couple people that are making decisions, but no one just punts and says, I don't know. And the difference between that is evident when you go into an organization and you say, what do you do? And the person says, oh, I'm on the Gmail team. Or you go into another organization, you say, what do you do? And someone says, I'm a Java developer. Those are very different perspectives. One is a group of people that are bonded around what they're producing, and another is a group of people that are bonded around what they do. And that might not be valuable. If you take these and you map them to some of the cool tools we have some brilliant tools. So I don't know who's using all of these tools, but this is an interesting tool. Is anybody in here doing collaborative chartering in their organization? Just out of curiosity. It's pretty lo-fi. I mean, if you saw my chartering template, it has 5 sentences or 5 words. It's really a discussion. It's not new. It's totally lifted out of the PMI space. Someone from that community said, gosh, you guys have a lot of good things going on, but it seems like sometimes you don't know where you're going, but you're really good at getting there. And Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, it's easy to not get there, which we're iteratively not getting places in a lot of situations. We have constant velocity to somewhere. And chartering, I think the only difference between what I'm doing and what is traditional is I threw out this idea of mission and vision statements, because I couldn't sit in another one of those discussions where we thrashed on those words for an hour. And I just kind of say it's more of like a marketing discussion. Why are we building what we're doing? Who's involved in it? What are some of our constraints? What do we know going in? So we go in with our eyes open. And it's not about producing the charter. It's about the dialogue around it, where a lot of that bonding happens that brings people together, because they get bonded around the thing they're building instead of the process they're using. It doesn't diminish the process they're using, but the focal point becomes around what they're doing. These are other tools just overtly stolen from the user experience community, not necessarily story mapping, but personas. And they're easy tools. So I did a session at the University of Minnesota. 15 minutes, we did a little example, might have been a half hour. I showed up at a company and they had this beautiful story map up, which helped them talk about where they're going. And that thing I showed earlier was an example of one of those story maps. Has a lot of that context you need to be successful. Another space outside the code I mentioned earlier is what is truly the next best investment for your team? Is it to queue up the next 10 stories that are on the top of the stack or at the front of the queue or in your backlog? By the way, a lot of the people outside of this space, when you say backlog, they think something that will never get done. And you might think, well, that's because they don't understand, but I hear that from those people all the time, secretly. The other secret I hear a lot of times is I'll be in a planning game, and one of the things I covertly do is write down how many times the developers have said refactoring. And so I was at this group, and I was on about 17. And this tester leaned over, and she said, what's refactoring? Because she doesn't know, it's not her fault, but no one's explained to her that it's a meaningful investment. They've just told her the mechanics of refactoring. This is how you do it. Oh, we need to do that. Maybe technical debt is a metaphor that takes us in this direction. This is Naresh and I working for a nonprofit. So part of my company is about philanthropy, and what I'm trying to kind of do is say, I think we're really great at delivery. And if you can kind of have a story map that says, here's where you're going, and you're really good at delivery. In fact, you're so good that you could maybe come up with 1,000 micro deliveries that would be really valuable for an organization at large. You would have the software equivalent of Kiva.org. And you could get 100 developers to each donate 10 hours, and you could produce an enormous amount of value. And so this is Naresh and I trying to figure out how to do this for this nonprofit called Free Set Bags in Calcutta. And so it was a greenfield project, and I said, well, we should maybe, let's do a little chartering, let's write some stories, maybe we use Rails. And Naresh and I tried some things, and it all just felt wrong. It felt heavy and clunky, and so we threw out a lot of that stuff because we kind of have the skills to do it, and we started improvising. And we said, well, really our mantra became, what is most valuable for FreeSet? What is really going to help this company? Is producing more software better for them? And the other mantra was that followed that up well is, do we need to write code? Because the more code you produce, even if it's tests, is more code. And the only code that has no bugs is no code. So more code is potentially problematic. And this is a really interesting model, and it harkens back to that aardvark group who's doing the same kind of thing. How do you produce more with less? Well, when you don't have any money, you don't get to run away from that question. And that's a really interesting notion. What is the least amount of process that's really needed? It might end up that that looks a little bit like Scrum, it might a little bit like XP, but it's really kind of contextually what's most meaningful. So I put this together as maybe a guess at an outsider's view. Because, again, maybe a lot of these people, for better or for worse, don't know these words. So this is, some mechanical stuff that we go through, and that's essential things. Like working in a project without continuous integration feels terrifying to me, because I feel like we don't know what we don't know. And then we get pretty good at delivering, and we start kind of doing some learning, and eventually we get good enough at that where learning happens often. It's not just at an iteration boundary, as a story boundary, and that's, I like the idea of kind of going from cycles to flow instead of kind of getting lost in an argument about who's winning. You got your Kanban in my Scrum, kind of like the Reese's peanut butter commercial. And so this is what I think we're driving towards, is what is success? What are you trying to produce? And if you're trying to grow this stuff in your organization, that should be a question that you're asking. I'm not sure how you get to have meaningful growth without asking that question. And so I would simplify it down to the best groove builder is learning, continuous learning, learning to learn. And organizations that don't find that space of how to learn keep practicing the same thing, and they might be able to do that consistently, but if it's not meaningful, doesn't matter how well you do it. And so that's if we go back to our little buddy here, what did Dude learn? Dude learned that it wasn't fun to grow up right away. He kind of had everything. He didn't have to go through any of the learning. He didn't have to go through the curve of saying, let's spread this to a couple teams. Maybe we'll have some small failures on this second team. He just got punched right up to being a guy, and then he ended up kind of back at Voltar, kind of going, yikes, I don't know if this is really where I want to be. And so that would be my question to you guys is how are you going to learn as you grow? When you're in a session at a conference or someone's teaching you or something, I would say, how are you going to assimilate this? And the second question was, does more Agile mean more agility? And I guess part of that challenge, to some people they might say, well, of course not. But yet there's still a lot of organizations where success is viewed in numbers of practices done, number of teams that have used Agile, number of people that are certified in some way. And I don't think that's a dangerous path for us to go down. And if you look at some of those other examples that I gave, there's issues there. They've gone through some of those same challenges. I don't want to go too deep into it other than to say there's no certification in music. When you hit the stage, you can either play or you can't. And the only way you get to hide is if you're a bass player. And you stand in the back and kind of just, it's a little bit easier. But that's because I'm a guitar player, and guitar players are always arrogant, and when they make a mistake, they blame the bass player. It's like, dude, what are you doing back there? So I didn't know if you guys wanted to head outside and have a beer. I didn't know if this would even draw a lot of questions. What I wanted to really do is kind of send you out into the rest of the conference thinking about some of these things. It's are frameworks what we want? How are we learning? Because that is the constant that I see in success, is that groups have figured out how to learn, and more importantly, how to learn to learn. So with that, I will shut up. I'm really bad at big endings. My little daughter, who's kind of a gymnast, always goes, ta-da, but I'm not much of a ta-da dude. So I will thank you for listening and send you on your way if you want to.